The Capital Confidential podcast is brought to you by the Times-Union, the leading newspaper in New York's capital region. Subscribe today or visit online at timesunion.com.
You want to deport an undocumented person? Start with me, because I'm an undocumented person.
How do we beat him in an election?
We will. I'm going to run against him.
I wish you would. I wish you would, Dad. I would.
There are things in here that are unobjectionable because they're not that effective. So yeah, sure, I'll vote for a distinctive license plate. Sure, why not?
Jim, you had your press conference at 4 o'clock.
You're having a press conference now?
That's
You're
right.
talking?
I'm having a press conference.
Well,
now.
is this your space here or is it public?
No, it's my space.
Oh, this is your
Don't
space.
interrupt.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Capital Confidential podcast. I'm your host, David Lombardo. This week in Albany saw the passage of the first major batch of gun safety initiatives since the SAFE Act in 2013, and legislative leaders say it won't be another 6 years before they adopt additional safety measures. While Democrats and gun control advocates were celebrating the legislation, it was a different story for most Republican lawmakers and opponents of restrictions to the Second Amendment. This episode focuses on their side of the story. You'll first hear from GOP Senator Patrick Gallivan, the former Erie County Sheriff, who has first-hand experience dealing with gun crimes. Our conversation touched on new legislation dealing with waiting periods, school safety, and gun buyback programs. Then you'll hear an interview that I conducted for my print story this week with Senator Daphne Jordan, a half-moon Republican. I asked her about the prospects of additional gun control measures, and we talked about the so-called red flag bill, which allows specific people to petition courts to have guns removed from a person who is deemed to be a threat to themselves or others. Enjoy the show. What kind of gun crimes were most common in Erie County when you were a sheriff? What did you see most regularly?
Oftentimes the violence that you saw back when I was sheriff and in law enforcement, and I think for the most part still true today, is tied to drugs. You see a lot of violence, unfortunately, in the inner cities, but so much of it is connected in some way, shape, or form to drugs.
And are you seeing gun crimes that are of malicious intent, that are accidents? Are they people trying to kill people trying to injure people, just threaten people? What do you see?
Well, all of the above. I think that people that are involved in the drug trade and live on the other side of the law that so many of us do, think nothing of using a weapon. So sometimes it's being used for retaliation. Sometimes it's being used for revenge. Sometimes the violence is a spur of the moment thing that people just engage for whatever reason, because they might think that they're in a threat, they're in fear of violence, so some perceived self-defense that then goes too far, or it might just be bullying, it might be threatening witnesses. But I would think that that's the bulk of what law enforcement deals with. Of course, you do have some other forms of violence that are not necessarily intended, an individual, one-on-one. Of course, you sometimes see things that are accidental, like an accidental discharge of a weapon, sometimes something connected to hunting. But I think by and large, the violence that ultimately lands people in prison, that law enforcement deals with at the largest level, in the largest sense, the bulk of what they're dealing with when it comes to violence is connected to other things.
So you mentioned a faction of criminals who live on the quote-unquote other side of the law. Does that make it then impossible to regulate the gun industry or I guess regulate the sale or possession of guns if people are already willing to break the law?
Well, I think that is an interesting point, and there should be some exclamation points behind it. I think that's precisely the problem when we see so much political rhetoric about guns and gun control. And there are some that put laws forward that essentially feel good, and they think that they're doing a good thing by putting these laws forward. Some argue, myself included, that many infringe upon the Second Amendment, and they're really ill-placed. They become nothing more than an inconvenience or intrusion on law-abiding citizens. and government resources aren't going to the right place. The eradication of illegal weapons, the illegal use of weapons. I mean, trying to get those weapons off the street and trying to focus on the illegality instead of creating new laws to create, I guess, instead of making new laws that infringe upon those that are already law-abiding citizens. But I think that's a challenge, and so many people are not willing to step back from the rhetoric and look at the real problem, and that's criminal behavior.
So it sounds like if you're saying what you need to do is address criminal behavior, then to deal with guns that are bought or in possession solely for the purpose of criminal activity, it sounds like you're saying you need to address the underlying criminal behavior because you're not going to be able to prevent these people from getting weapons.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that the series of laws, like the SAFE Act, like some of the legislation that we have seen, that we saw in Albany this particular week, is more focused on the gun and the law-abiding gun owner, as opposed to focusing on the illegal use of weapons that has taken place and trying to do something about that. Now, what can we do about that? We can put more resources towards law enforcement. We can put more resources towards the interdiction of illegal weapons that are out on the street, whether it's through training, whether it's through additional resources for various law enforcement agencies, whether it's dedicating law enforcement solely to the eradication of illegal weapons. And then we can have corresponding penalties that go along with it that can provide a deterrent. And I'll give an example of a federal program that was implemented when I was sheriff, and I was sheriff of Erie County from 1998 to 2005. So it was during that particular time. But there was a federal program, and I forget who initiated it, but the federal program was called Project Exile. If you illegally possessed a weapon or illegally used a weapon, immediately you'd have a minimum of, I believe it was a year in prison. That number isn't so important if I'm mistaken on that. But the idea was that you were doing time in federal prison, and in a sense then, this is where the name came from, they were exiled to a federal prison that was far away from their home. Some might think that part is inhumane, they can't be near families, but there's just not a lot of federal prisons around. So if you're from Buffalo, I think the nearest federal prison that you might land in is somewhere in Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, the impact on the street was that the people talking on the streets didn't want to be exiled. So while they still have committed some acts of violence, it was with a knife or a baseball bat. And there was a reduced use of illegal weapons on the streets of Buffalo during that particular time. There was actually a reduced violence from weapons. So that's an example of something that can be done about getting illegal guns off the street. Simply extending a waiting period, simply saying that we're going to do this red flag legislation and not dealing with the individual who has the mental health issues, that's not getting that illegal weapon off the street. That's creating the problem.
Well, so you mentioned the waiting period bill that the legislature took up this week, and it allows for up to 30 days to complete a background check. And I'm wondering, this was one of the bills that you voted against. How come that's a proposal in the wrong direction in your vision?
I just don't think that it does anything. It doesn't do anything with the criminal on the street.
Okay.
I guess the statistic is over 90% of people that are going to purchase a weapon, and what I'm told is that over 90% of those that are purchasing a weapon and they do the NICS background check, they have the ability to purchase the weapon that day without any problem. The background check is returned and they're allowed to make the purchase. Under current law, if for some reason that the results are inconclusive, the government has 3 days essentially to say, you can't buy that. Otherwise, they could go ahead and purchase the weapon. The proposal extends that to 30 days. Mm-hmm. Well, what I would simply say is government should be doing its job, and that law-abiding citizen shouldn't be the one to suffer because government isn't doing their job and submitting the records or returning a records check. And here in this case, 30 days in particular, Federal background checks, when you do that next check, expire at the end of 30 days. So let's just say you have a 30-day waiting period and the results come back inconclusive. This could be a perpetual thing for an individual. You go, you make application, you try to buy a weapon, it comes back inconclusive. You have to wait for 30 days before you can get the weapon, but at the end of 30 days, if the results don't come back, it's still inconclusive. The background check has expired and you've got to do it all over again.
My understanding was if the 30 days expires and they haven't completed it, you can purchase the weapon.
My understanding is that that background check would expire in 30 days, so another one would have to be done. But regardless with that point, even if I'm mistaken or I'm not informed properly on that, we still have the notion of government holding something up, keeping something away from a law-abiding citizen who simply wants to exercise the rights that they're entitled to under the Second Amendment.
Okay. And I was curious, when you were in Erie County, or as a legislator, did you ever have a gun buyback program? And if so, did you ever find it to be effective?
No, when I was sheriff, we didn't participate in any, but I'm familiar with them, and there was a number of them in Erie County or in the city of Buffalo. And my observation and what I understand from the research that's out there is that they are largely ineffective in removing the weapons that are out there, that are out on the streets being used illegally. You end up in many cases with that, the weapon that Great-Grandpa Joe brought back from the war, the weapon that is an antique, the weapon that somebody might have forgotten about. And if it's sitting there and there's nobody qualified to possess it or use it, we don't want it there, and we don't want it to land in the hands of somebody who uses it the wrong way. But there are already mechanisms in place for somebody to lawfully turn in a weapon of that nature. So while it does feel good, and while it does get some weapons that are not used turned in, what has been shown across the country is these aren't the weapons. These aren't impacting the violence. The violence continues in many of the major cities, despite the laws.
Do you think it's possible that there will ever be some sort of grand bargain on gun control, gun safety, gun violence? Because, as a reporter, when I hear people talk about these issues, I hear people speak about it in a completely different language. You've talked a lot about deterrent as a way to prevent gun violence. Proponents of gun control talk about a whole different language about it. And I'm wondering if people are sort of speaking in different terms and view it as completely different context, is there ever a potential to reach some sort of negotiation or to reach some sort of compromise?
That's really a great question, and that's something that all citizens deserve. Of course, it's possible. But in the rhetoric that we see today, between the far right and the far left, we see it coming out of Washington, we see it in Albany, and we see it reported upon. Somebody calls me a name, and the citizens are anxiously awaiting for somebody to report the name that I call them back. And I think everybody has a responsibility to try to change that. So if those of us that are in these elected positions are responsible, we would do exactly that. If there's enough of us trying to have a rational discussion about what we can do to reduce gun violence. I'll move a little bit off the direct subject and give you an example when it comes to school safety. How do we keep schools safe? There's no magic bullet, so to speak. There's no single one thing. It's a holistic approach. So I believe very strongly in school resource officer program. And in a school resource officer is, yes, it's a police officer, and yes, that police officer is armed, and yes, that police officer helps to provide some security for a school. But that police officer in that school setting is much, much more, the effective ones. They're really community police officers, and we have rhetoric out there about the lack of communication between the police and the community, and people clamoring and saying that, hey, the police have to get into the community, be part of the community, understand what we're all about, engage with people. That's exactly what these school resource officers do, and yet the same people that want police engaging with them in the neighborhoods don't want them engaging in schools in the exact way that they're talking about. So nonetheless, I think you look at a holistic approach, and even the laws that are in place that prohibit weapons on school grounds, unless a school administrator says it's okay. So you've got the combination of government resources, policies, laws, and people working together to create a safe environment. But I would say you use that same model in the community. There's no one thing that'll work. Taking guns away from everybody isn't going to stop violence. Locking somebody up and throwing away the key isn't going to stop things. It's people working together and cooperating with each other and trying to find common ground on the mutual goals that they have. And it does start with elected officials, but we see so much rhetoric, it's unfortunate. So in this day and age, unfortunately, there's not as much cooperation amongst the elected officials of both parties with each other as there should be.
Okay. Well, Senator, I appreciate you reflecting on this issue with me, and thank you so much for your time.
Okay, Dave. Great talking with you.
And we're taking a quick break from the show to hear from one of our potential Capital Confidential sponsors, like Vistaprint, the #1 choice for all your micro-stamping needs. Or Samsonite. You know how durable their bags are, so why not try out their gun safes? Let's get back to the show and our conversation with Senator Daphne Jordan. This morning, the governor, talking about today's package, he described it as part of an ongoing crusade. Senator Stuart Cousins, said it's not going to be another 6 years before there's more legislation indicating they're going to bring up additional stuff. So, what do you think about when you hear that from the governor and Senate Majority Leader?
I'm going to go with the 2A people and say what they think. That little by little, we're just going to keep chipping away at your Second Amendment rights, and until there aren't any.
Gotcha. And I guess thinking about this, the red flag bill. Mm-hmm. Where does your concern with that stem from?
Well, the way it's initiated, first of all, there's a lack of rules on that. So anyone that's disgruntled against someone else can go out and claim,
But that's not true, though.
Go to a judge.
It's not anyone. The bill doesn't say anyone can do it. It specifies who can do it. Yeah, there's a list of identified people in it.
I'm not sure about that. Anyway, it sets up for malicious temporary extreme risk orders brought up against someone who may not actually have a mental health issue. It's too easy to come by. There's not even a medical doctor's advice needed in order to get one of these temporary risk protection orders. So if you go to the judge and you say, I really believe this person is going to harm himself or somebody else. Well, says who? You? And the judge is going to decide based on what?
Well, I guess
there's no medical doctor's opinion necessary. No mental health professional has to weigh in on that. Okay, so then you have this whole process initiated against somebody. And the gun doesn't even have to be theirs. It could be someone else living in the house. Their guns. And do you know how hard the process is to get back the gun once it's taken away?
Well, I guess in this it's
difficult.
Temporary,
and it becomes not temporary very easily. So it's
you're
problematic.
Worried that a lot of people are going to start going after people unwarranted.
That could happen. It's easy to allow that to happen.
And you feel the threshold for taking away the guns is too low, as described in this bill.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Good choice of words there.
That's pay me for it. Well, unless there was anything else you want to add, I appreciate you making the time. That's all I had for you.
I don't know what else to say other than that. I really don't feel that this was a gun safety package, and like a lot of the bills that have been put forth by the new majority, have not really been well thought out. And they haven't. I can go through each bill and pick out things. Yeah, no public hearings, no, we're going to rush them right from rules right to a vote.
Although, a lot of these bills have passed the Assembly for years now.
However, when you know that they're not going to really be passed and
Right.
made into law, people don't take a close look.
So
Now,
cynical.
it's true. Now, people take a look because they know it can happen.
Okay.
And so now they're being reviewed, and you see how awful they are.
Okay. And that's our show. My thanks to Senators Gallivan and Jordan for shedding some insight on their thoughts about gun control. If you enjoyed the show from an Apple device, please leave us a review. It could help us move up the iTunes rankings to number 132 on the non-explicit state news podcast list. We're currently behind Monkeying Around in Montana and ahead of Jerry Brown Tribute Hour. If you have an idea for a future podcast, connect with us on Twitter at TUCapCon or leave us a note at the Capitol Confidential Facebook page. Until next time, podcast adjourned.
Just heard I tried to get you.
This day sucks.